This, ladies and gentlemen, is London. Swinging London, it's been called, though some people might find a different adjective. Social rebels have taken over in what seems more like an invasion than a revolution, because they've got their own new language that is way out and weird, to say the least. About the kids who have cocked a snook at almost everything a lot of folk hold dear. Remember, youth has always had a fight to assert its independence, and it's always had its successes. But Teddy Boys seems traditional compared to this. Is there any hope? There must be. That girl certainly learned to dig advanced mathematics, and she's not unique because here's an up-to-the-minute girl in a sober publishing firm who has started editing a youngster's magazine. You see this when you open the door. The decor's different. Here youth talks direct to youth in its own lingo, and under the trimmings, there's discipline. Perhaps it's only the slang and the fashion that's really changed. The youngsters on the staff of Intro magazine are aware that in the fashion world too, youth talks to youth. Designer Mary Quant is just one of the breakaway generation who has now dreamed up a revolutionary approach to young cosmetics, which even department stores like Selfridges have taken up. Remember that this is big export business too, like the Beatles and the freaky fashions this young generation created to some horror. And whoever faced the predicament of a girl with a paper dress who wants to sunbathe in the park? Because even young people aren't used to these new poster dresses, which in fact can be worn again and again, and though they're made of paper, can even be washed. No, people aren't used to paper dresses, but even the young ones are sometimes meticulous about litter. And that's another point in their favor. But it doesn't always help. We're watching these wayward kids critically, but detached, and, well, you've got to face it, they're not as feckless as their elders would like to think. Bob Dylan's one of their current pop stars, and paper dresses, after all, are expendable. You can wear a dream for a week. Remember, older generations had Oxford bags, bobbed hair, +4s, new looks. Intro magazine, the kids' own do-it-yourself answer to the squares in their midst, simply ferrets out what's happening and reports on the new youth scene, not only in London, but throughout the country. The new scene, which seems so baffling, is countrywide.
One more story about throwaway fashion and that sort of contradiction of the 1960s and our kind of popular perception of hippie culture. And that is best encapsulated, this idea of throwaway fashion in the paper dress. So usually it's the Scott Company, the Scott Paper Company, that's given credit with producing the first paper dress. They were already producing throwaway garments. I mean, this is in some ways weirdly a very timely story because they were making throwaway garments for hospital workers out of a material called Duraweave, which was a cellulose material. It's a little bit like the waxy material that tear-proof like FedEx envelopes are made of, if you kind of know what that material is. So it's not exactly like as flimsy as paper, the way you might think. But they were producing these dresses, and you can see some on the bottom left with these kind of bright patterns like this paisley, which is meant to look like a bandana, or an op art pattern, the black and white on the right. And they were used to promote the company's new paper plate range. So the idea, and you can again also see this in the Hallmark ad at the top, was, you know, you could have a party and match your party dress to your plates. You know, because that's the thing you might want to do. Other companies jumped on this bandwagon. So Campbell's Soup actually produced this super dress as a promotion for the company, playing off, of course, of Andy Warhol's paintings of the soup can. There were political paper dresses. Here's one for the Nixon campaign, which I think is the most surprising one from 1968. Democrats also produced these, by the way. So it's kind of interesting So the idea that Nixon supporters would be wearing these. And there is also, of course, the poster dress, which you see at the top center. Here's one with Bob Dylan on it, which actually in the collection of MoMA, which is kind of interesting. This throwaway dress actually ends up in a museum. So these became these sort of palettes for really any kind of print you wanted, whether it was a photograph of a pop icon or the name of a political candidate, or a company's logo. And there were multiple companies besides Campbell's and Scott that use these as promotionals. There were also paper garments for men. Here is a man's paper shirt from Germany that's in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it has, I sort of love that it has this like big flower on it that says, "I like girls." And then it's covered with names of girls, including famous ones or just like random girls. So there's like Brigitte Bardot and Raquel Welch, but then there's also like Peggy and Liz. And I think this starts to give us a sense of what I was hinting at in my introduction of the ways that there was this kind of anxiety with the Peacock Revolution around masculinity and sexuality, and this anxiety among some of the men who wore these clothes as to whether they would be associated with gay men and whether they would be straight. So like the idea that this shirt has to say on it, "I like girls. Don't worry, I'm straight, even though I'm wearing this pink and green and like brightly colored paper shirt." So I think this reveals some of the anxiety around these gender codes. And we already talked a little bit about kind of about that anxiety when we were looking at queer culture and the ways in which gay men were, using fashion in these more covert ways to speak to one another. So this is sort of the flip side in a sense, and reveals some of the ways that straight men's homophobia kind of comes to bear on the kinds of garments that they use. So one response to that, which I think we especially see in American fashion, is the adoption of brighter colors and kind of bolder styles, but packaging them in more kind of classic or and in a sense like class-based packages. Sorry to be repetitive. One example of this is the resurgence of Madras Plaid. This is another story that that takes us to India for a minute. So Madras Plaid is a style of plaid, a style of weaving plaid that comes from Madras in India. It's usually pronounced Madras in terms of plaid, and I'm not totally sure how to pronounce the name of this city in India. So I'm going to use Madras since we're talking about the material, and that's how it's pronounced here anyway. So you're seeing it on the top left on some characters in the television show Mad Men, in one of the seasons where it takes place in the 1960s. And you can see an ad for it from Saks Fifth Avenue for the University shop. So it's associated with this kind of, especially now with this sort of preppy style. And that's because there's this association that's constructed in advertising to particularly to Ivy League schools. And so that sort of campus style that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. And you're seeing this ad on the right-hand side with the headline, "How 3 Trunks of India Madras Started Yale University." And so this article is talking about Elihu Yale, who is the namesake of Yale University, who gave the first money and goods for the endowment. And the claim that's being made in this article is that it was Madras fabric that was part of the original founding money of Yale. And in fact, Elihu Yale was, I think the governor. He was part of the colonizing forces in India, and in particular, he was in Madras. So there is a connection. What I think is really interesting, when I was trying to, I had read about this ad. This is from the Hathaway Shirt Company that had this really inexplicable series of ads where Ogilvy, who did their advertising, decided like, we need a more interesting picture than just like an old guy in a shirt, so let's put him in an eye patch and see what happens. I'm not even making this up, this is true, to give it what one of the advertisers called story appeal. So people would be like, what is this ad about? And it worked, apparently. So you can find, if you go online and just Google up Hathaway shirts, you can find all kinds of ads with men in eye patches wearing their shirts. And this one, you can see the man in the Madras shirt in India, or, you know, a place that is supposed to look like India. Who knows? He was probably just in a studio with this as a backdrop. But in any case, the story that's being told is this sort of colonial connection to India, and a connection to an American Ivy League school, to sort of cement this connection between this style of plaid and American Ivy League style. What I think is really interesting is when I was searching for this, the other thing that comes up when you start searching Yale and Madras is the fact that Elihu Yale held slaves in Madras, and I think helped to export slaves, and calls for Yale to change its name. So it's really interesting to me how in the 1960s you can have an ad that is using this colonial narrative as a selling point for a garment, and then now it is very different. I don't think anyone would make this ad now. The other thing that's really fascinating about these ads is that Madras fabrics, textiles, are made from cotton yarns that are dyed with natural vegetable dyes. And the threads are dyed first, then the fabric is woven, and the dyes can either bleed or fade when the fabric is washed. And so American consumers started getting these fabrics and then got really mad because the color bled, or they didn't realize they needed to wash it in cold water. And so the advertisers decided, like, oh, let's use that as a marker of authenticity. So all of the ad copy here, if you can look very closely, you see there's a headline that says guaranteed to fade. So that became a selling point of Madras. And a lot of the ads talk about that as a kind of note of class and distinction, that your Madras fades. So that's how people know it's real Madras and not, you know, a knockoff, which there were knockoffs of this style of fabric, like really early on. It starts being imported to the US as early as 1784. And by like the 20s and 30s, there are copies of it being knocked off, and those didn't fade. So you didn't have the real thing if your Madras didn't fade. So I think it's a really interesting story of marketing, in this period. And what I want to do next is just show you a clip from the television show Mad Men, which I think will kind of set up this anxiety in the period around dressing, particularly in relationship to sexuality for men, as well as around race too, and sort of this way of communicating white masculinity specifically. And in the clip, what I'm showing you is a birthday party scene for Don Draper, the lead character, who you can see on the far left of that image in his Madras suit or sport coat there. And he's married to a younger woman, Megan, who you'll see in a very short black mini dress. And Megan throws a surprise party for him with some of his work colleagues as well as her friends. And you really see, I think, in this scene, the reason I want to show it to you is this kind of generational clash, particularly among the men, in terms of how they present themselves, how they fashion themselves, and their anxiety around the other people in the space in certain ways. And so it's a really interesting scene to watch them kind of negotiate and comment on what other men are wearing. So take a look at that. I'd love to talk about it more in the discussion with you all, but I think you'll see a lot of the things I'm talking about, this anxiety around dressing, this sort of tentative on the part of some of the older and more conservative men, tentative ways of sort of looking towards some of these peacock styles, but then also, retreating back into the comfort of the suit. And I think the Madras sport coat kind of represents this like safe adoption for many men of the kind of peacock styles, but within the confines of a traditional suit and traditional codes of kind of class, and I think really particularly white masculinity in this case. So like look out for those things in this clip, and I think you'll see what I mean in terms of the clash of generations.
Not a joke. The Vietnamese are fighting a civil war. There is no monolithic communism. It's an excuse.
Really? Come on, Bert. It's for profit. Bombs are the perfect product. They cost a fortune, and you only use them once.
So I suppose this young man here is coming home in a bag for nothing. If he's lucky. You ever read Johnny Got His Gun? No eyes, no ears, no nose, tapping out his last wishes in Morse code with his deformed head.
I thought there were going to be girls here.
For purely selfish reasons, I want to thank you for excluding Joe. I would have had to buy earplugs for the ride home. It wasn't up to me, you know? Hell of a party. Jennifer couldn't make it. I'm sorry to hear that. No, she couldn't get a date. Anyway, I know she said no gifts, but I got you this. Open it. But you don't have to if you don't want to. It's a silver-handled walking stick.
Oh, look, he got you a cane.
Don Amici has one. It's a Steinway walking stick.
You could stick it up your ass and have a concert.
Thank you very much. Hello. Negro, homosexual, Canadian sex bot, and unaccompanied redhead. This may be my key demographic.
Don't. Just leave it alone. I know. You're wondering what they're laughing about. It's not you.
Well, I, for one, think you're very brave, Megan. My mother always said a woman should surprise her husband every day.
That's why they had no lock on the WC.
It's true.
Look at you delivering drinks. We should get your pair of roller skates.
Roger, I didn't know you were invited. Or did you just hear I was coming and show up?
Is he going bold? Just goes on and on.
It's beautiful, but it's very loud. Listen, you can hear the traffic even over this party.
I know.
Who cares? I just want to take my pants off and slide my ass on the carpet.
How's the summer treating you?
Well, it's been good because it's been bad.
What do you do exactly?
Oh, he's a journalist.
Underground papers, mostly. You may not have seen it.
And what exactly has been bad?
I don't know. 4 riots in 3 cities in 2 months?
It is terrible, and Lord knows the police aren't much help.
I was raised sex, politics, and religion aren't party talk.
Well, what does that mean?
I don't know. Alcohol and work. Hello again. Truth, which one is Jane Sterling again?
The glamour puss with the tan?
Very early and often.
Thinking about smoking some tea with Megan's friends out there. Keep an eye out for Don.
As long as you're just thinking about it.
You should join us. Kenny gets brave and recites poems.
But she thinks they're good.
Oh, absolutely. Megan was the best waitress they ever had.
No, but I did get the best tips.
How did you manage that?
She laid on that accent. You know, she's a really good actress.
Not good enough, obviously.
Julia, come here for a second.
There. Hello. Glad you could come. Great party.
You got a great spread here.
I just wanted to make sure we said hi. I can't stay that long. I have to go back and redo the Heinz pitch. But I guess you know that. Come on, Dad.
What are you doing?
Was that bad?
Now look who you're talking to. How do I know?
Okay, everyone, my friends. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for coming. And second of all, I think I've had just enough to drink that I'm ready to give my own present to the birthday boy.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I think we should call it a night.
Absolutely not, Don. You stay there.
Did you buy him a pony?
1, 2, 3, 4. Zooby zooby zoo. Zooby zooby zoo.
I think that gives you a sense of the sorts of negotiations that are going on in terms of how men are dressing in this period. And there were a few American designers who I think really capitalized on this in a sense. And they also capitalized, I think, on this new interest in men's fashion, which, you know, had been kind of laid dormant for a while and was pretty staid and traditional. Bill Blass is one of these men. He was an American ready-to-wear designer and mostly specialized in sportswear and women's sports-inspired women's wear. And you can see him there with two models in his clothes in the kind of sepia-toned photograph in the center there. And so he launched a very successful menswear line in 1967. He was among the 5 designers who were selected American designers to show at the legendary Versailles show in 1973. And some of you all may choose to read an interview with him as your document for this week, which is really fascinating. And what I think that you'll find in it is the way in which he describes negotiating this kind of peacock revolution and how he talks about the customer that he imagines himself designing for, which is not the most daring customer, but rather one who is a little bit afraid of dressing in daring ways. And he really notes this shift that he sees in the fashion industry, which he describes very explicitly in this interview Blass gave to Nora Ephron, who was writing then for the New York Times. He says, quote, "I spoke to a group of manufacturers, and they told me there were 2 minority groups that doomed every fashion development: the homosexuals and the Negroes. Acceptance by these groups supposedly made fashion unacceptable to the rest of the population. But things have changed. Another minority group, the young, changed everything. The young could wear the most effeminate clothes without being suspect in the least. And the other minority groups have suddenly become acceptable," end quote. I think that gives you a really strong sense of how race and racism and homophobia played into the fashion landscape in really powerful ways in this period. And even for a designer, maybe even particularly for a designer like Blass, who was a closeted gay man, this had very particular kind of resonance. And I think it speaks to something that Joe Paoletti really leaves unexplored in the reading that you're doing this week, in her book, Sex, Unisex, Fashion, Feminism, and the Sexual Revolution. She has this really interesting hint, right, about how as she's looking at her primary sources, she's seeing images of men of color in the most kind of daring and outlandish styles when she's looking at things like the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog or advertisements. But she doesn't really do anything with that. She doesn't really explore it. And I think Blass's remarks there give you a sense of like why that might be, why those images persist, the sense that men of color had a more outrageous style, and that their masculinity was less in question in those styles, which I think is very much linked to these stereotypes of African American men, Hispanic men, men of color, those particular groups as being hypersexualized in these stereotypical images. The only thing that Paoletti gives us is a reference to the great writer Monica Miller, and talks about and says, quote, this is Paoletti here, quote, "These restrictions played out differently for men of color. African American and Latino men's dress includes a tradition of flamboyance, despite, or as Monica Miller has argued, as a response to oppression or subservient status," end quote. And so this is one of the things that I think is really interesting to explore, as opposed to what I think Paoletti does, which is just kind of ignore it. In any case, I'll give you an example of a way we can explore that in just a moment. Another designer from this period who I think also kind of negotiates this more conservative take on the Peacock Revolution is Ralph Lauren, who was born, you should know, Ralph Lifshitz, and changed his name so he wouldn't sound so Jewish. Not making this up, people. This is true. And, you know, it makes sense. If you think about what Ralph Lauren became known for, it was essentially WASP style, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So if you have any kind of dedication to that style, just know that it was designed by a guy named Ralph Lifshitz. I think it's a classic American story of rebranding and reconstructing your identity to do what you want to do. He starts off designing neckties, and then eventually, for a company, by the way, called Beau Brummel. So link back to week one. In any case, that's where he starts, and then he sets out on his own and founds this company called Polo, Ralph Lauren, and also continues making neckties, but also begins to make suiting. He designs suits for The Great Gatsby in 1976. And really that style of kind of 1920s look has a big influence on his style. His work is in some ways very backwards looking. But you can see this emphasis on ease, on comfort in some of these looks, this idea of sort of upper class sportswear, all of these kind of coded references that make these styles safely tied with masculinity because of their ties with the past, but still embracing some more potentially forward-looking ideas like wearing a color every once in a while. So you see that there's a real kind of move backward in certain cases by certain designers to open up a kind of more middle of the road way of embracing the Peacock Revolution. Okay, so going back to this question around race that I opened up a few moments ago, another style icon we could look to in the 1970s is this guy, Walt Clyde Fraizier. And I hope some of you will read the primary sources that are associated with him so you can get a better sense of him. He was a basketball player. And he was very well known for his unique and very flamboyant personal style. You can see him in a couple of different full-length mink coats here, stylish hats, two-tone shoes. And you can start to see some of those references back to the 1920s. In fact, that's actually where his nickname Clyde comes from. In 1967, a film called Bonnie and Clyde was released about the famous couple, notorious, I guess I should say, starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty. And you're seeing some stills of it here. It's a very violent film. Just a warning if you wanna watch it. I don't really love it because it's so violent, but lots of people love it. But that being said, the costumes are knockouts. They are this great encapsulation of kind of Depression era gangster style. The film takes place in the 1930s. And they were really appealing both to men and women, and started a real trend. And Clyde got really excited about this style, this kind of 30s style, and so took on that nickname. And if I go back to the way he dresses, you can see him embracing some of that kind of 30s tailoring. Of course, you remember we talked about the raccoon coats and college style in the 1920s. So a lot of his style is calling back to some of those historical fashions. And he was not alone. Bonnie and Clyde created a real style trend, this trend towards looking to the 1930s. There were other things, but this movie in particular really seemed to coalesce a lot of them, as well as this kind of gangster style. I'm going to show you a clip here from a British Pathé newsreel that'll give you some idea of how this fad took off.
Better to let your hair down than swinging Carnaby Street, the trendiest fun fashion centre in the world, where the roaring 20s are all the rage with the in-set. Yes, this is the place where it all happens. The narrow Soho side street, where the shop windows bulge with a brand of bold clobber and extras that breathe new life into even the model set. Reason for the revelry on this occasion was a real switched-on event, by no means a load of rubbish. Carnaby Street was setting off a year Yuletide, and when they got lit up in the street of super styles, it was really something. As the scene setters say, it's just too much. A few years ago, Carnaby Street was a narrow, unimportant thoroughfare, tucked away behind world-famous Regent Street. Today, it's a different story. For fashion-conscious youngsters, it's Mecca. And for foreign visitors, it's as much of an attraction as that nearby noble route. So the kids let rip with a great rave, with their street put on their own Christmas show of lights. Don't be too ready to put the wrong interpretation on the arms handout. They're just props that happen to go with the fashionable craze for Bonnie and Clyde styles. And they don't have to use any persuasion in Carnaby Street to win big overseas sales. They just set the fashion, and with it world markets come and collect. It's quite a racket. So come on inside. The gear's great. In the Carnaby Street local, they'd never heard of Prohibition. This was party time. There were grapes galore, natural and bottled. And big beat personalities like Long John Baldry were joining in the fun. Reg Presley of the Trogs. And that very bonny girl, Faye Dunaway. It was the greatest night in the short history of short skirts and the things that created them. Way out clothes meant the way in for Carnaby Street.
So you can see how much this trend kind of caught on. And here are two ads for this very interesting men's clothing company called His, or HIS, which advertised itself as making anti-establishment clothing, which I don't know if you can really advertise yourself doing, but that's besides the point. If you look at the ad on the right, you can see that the ad reads, "They would never understand why you'd wear a suit that looks like it's from a 1930s movie. They don't matter to us, as long as you know that our double-breasted suit is the up to date as an underground movie." And so they're selling this suit as being kind of anti-establishment because it's looking back to the 1930s. And you can see that kind of pinstriped gangster style. You can see the two-tone shoes. He's got the cigar. So there's this kind of, these kind of masculinist elements to this look. And the marketing of this as being anti-establishment, as being underground. So they're using all of that language. Also notice on the left-hand side, we have an ad that is attempting by the same company to capitalize on the Black Power movement. Instead of Black Power, it's Slack Power, with these plaid trousers. And there are a couple of ads that I've seen from this company that use men who are just dressed in pants, no shirts on. And so I think there is this effort in these ads both to market the clothing as anti-establishment, and to capitalize on that idea of young people wanting to dress differently than the establishment and the kind of politics of the period, but also on the politics of the civil rights movement and on trying to construct a very masculine image in these advertisements. So I think they're quite fascinating artifacts in and of themselves to study. There were lots of stars, by the way, in the sports world who helped to popularize these kinds of peacock styles. So Joe Namath, Joe Pepitone, there are others, but just to give you a few more images. So out of their uniform, wearing much more expressive, textured, interesting clothes. Here's another couple ads from his, just because they're totally fascinating. I think it's really interesting to see this attempt at diversity in their advertisements in this period, perhaps as a way of setting themselves apart from other companies and sort of playing with that idea of being outside of the establishment. Also, headlines like "End the Draft" to market this coat. Anti-war protests began around 1964 in the U.S. as the Vietnam War had been raging since the mid-1950s. And so using that protest line, "End the Draft," to sell a coat to end the draft that makes you cold. It's a kind of classic story of the ways in which marketing and capitalism tends to swallow up these, anti-establishment, as the tagline moments says. So Frazier, by the way, writes his own style guide, his own style manual. I have a copy of it. Let me know if you want to read part of it. It's called Rockin' Steady: A Guide to Basketball and Cool. And it's really a fascinating book. Yes, I have actually read it, believe it or not. And one of the things that he says, which I think in some ways kind of rhymes with the quotation from Monica Miller that Paoletti uses in her book, he says this about his style in there. Quote, "Cool is a matter of self-preservation, of survival. It must go back to the slave days when oftentimes all a black man had to defend himself was his poise." End quote. So I think it's a really interesting statement of his sort of reflecting on his own identity and these postures of being cool and what does it mean to be cool. And you'll see this if you choose to read the magazine articles about him. I think they're really fascinating because there's very much an emphasis on him as this kind of swinging bachelor in the period, which is really different from the traditions of respectability politics that we've talked about during the semester. And I think it's interesting to see how he used fashion as a way of constructing his public identity in this period, and would eventually turn that both to his advantage in terms of publishing his book, but he also had a deal with Puma. He was one of the early athletes to have a deal having his own custom designed Pumas. And they actually just relaunched the original Clydes, I think last year or 2 years ago. Anyway, he really blazed the trail, I think, for the athletes, particularly in basketball, but I think athletes of all kinds who engage with the world of fashion. He was really one of the trailblazers for sure in this area, and not enough remembered for that, I think. So I want to introduce you to him, and I hope we'll be able to talk about some of those sources in our discussion. So the idea of unisex, which you'll be reading about for this week in Paoletti's book, I just wanted to give you a few images to kind of have in your mind for this. And these are all from primary sources from the 1970s. New York Magazine on the left, you see Geraldo Rivera. Wow, why was that hard to say? You see Geraldo Rivera and one of his friends, Jackie Rogers, who runs a clothing shop, in matching caftans. P.S. That was the same Geraldo Rivera who had things to say about people wearing hoodies, okay, when we were talking about hoodies. So just FYI. Same guy, making comments about people's clothes in his caftan. Okay. Anyway, moving on. Also this great ad for Canadian Mist. There's a whole series of these Canadian Mist ads that are really amazing. And they have these kind of paired his and hers outfits, which you can order if you drink enough Canadian Mist. And here you have them in matching caftans, which I love. I love the caftan. We'll talk more about the caftan next week as a potential utopian fashion. But these unisex looks. And of course, the caftan also has non-Western origins that we should note in North Africa and the Middle East in particular. There were all kinds of unisex, his and hers fashion looks marketed in this period. Here are some pages from the Sears catalog. And you can see there's this very kind of heteronormative way in which these styles are being marketed, right, as sort of couple styles. So there's no anxiety about the sexuality here because, you know, it's a man and woman paired up wearing these same styles. So in some ways, it almost seems like these are a way of mitigating the anxiety about, you know, women wearing trousers and things like that. Here you've got some pages from the Sears catalog, which start to show you some of the ways that these peacock styles we were seeing in London kind of filtered down into everyday American men's fashion. So the Edwardian look that you can see there on the left, some colors and accessories on the right-hand side, for instance. Sorry, more his, that's a very young Nick Nolte, P.S., the blonde in the middle there on the left-hand side. And then, of course, we can't talk about the 70s without talking about the leisure suit, which is kind of the iconic garment of that period. But, you know, this is, in some ways, like, not that different from those leisure suits of the 1950s. It's being made out of polyester now. It's being made out of synthetic materials. It might be made in a double knit. It might be a little bit stretchy, more comfortable, more leisurely, as it were. Plaids, bright colors, worn with a turtleneck, perhaps. But these were, I think, intended to be a kind of like easier interpretation of some of these peacock styles. If you couldn't deal with like thrifting, or you didn't really want to wear like ruffles and, you know, historical styles, you could just get a pink leisure suit, and then you were embracing these new modern styles. So it's an interesting negotiation of these different trends and thinking about how one might express masculinity with so many more choices on offer.